In this video, we continue our journey along the Chicago Great Western route from Chicago to Olwine, Iowa, visiting all of the disused stations along the way. This time, we complete the journey through Jo Daviess County, visiting Portage Curve, before proceeding onward to East Dubuque. We then investigate tunnels hewn from solid rock and massive wrought iron bridges, which lead us to our final destination, that being the venerable Dubuque, Iowa.
In our previous video, we left off at Galena Junction, a former Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy depot shared with the Chicago Great Western, and situated at the confluence of the Galena River and the Mississippi River. The Portage Curve station is just a short distance further on, a little more than a half-mile to the northwest. Today the area is somewhat isolated, and there are no roads or pathways that we know of to take us to the former site, so we'll use the drone for a flyover.
The Portage Curve station actually originated as a result of the junction of the Illinois Central Railway with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railway, and the Chicago Great Western Railway. The Illinois Central first built its railroad from nearby Galena to Dunleith, later East Dubuque, as early as 1855. That railroad was the only game in town for decades, until the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad arrived in the mid-1880s, which attempted to take control of a portion of the IC's right-of-way along the Mississippi River through court actions, so that they could build their own trackage. But that gambit ultimately failed in the Illinois Supreme Court. The Chicago Great Western, a la the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City Railway, arrived a few years later, in the late 1880s, and had to negotiate with both the Illinois Central and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy for rights to travel over their combined rail system.
Whereas the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy and the Chicago Great Western ultimately worked out a junction between their railroads at Galena Junction, both had to merge onto Illinois Central trackage less than a mile northwest. This happened at Portage Curve, where the Illinois Central bends sharply around a limestone bluff, a tight curve with a 700-foot radius.
With the arrival of the Chicago Great Western in January of 1888, a switch was installed at Portage Curve to enable CGW trains to pass on to Illinois Central trackage from Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy trackage. It took weeks of wrangling between the three railways to work out a solution.
The first appearance of a station at Portage Curve comes from the 1893 plat map of the area, placing the depot at just about the point where the track straightens out after coming around the curve on its journey northwest. The depot appears to have been an Illinois Central station, but it was likely informally used by both the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy and the Chicago Great Western patrons, although it doesn't appear on either of their schedules.
In fact, in September of 1893, the station was used as a destination for a scheduled boxing match between two fighters, Billy Hines of Providence, Rhode Island, and Jack Edwards of Chicago. The fight was scheduled for a Sunday morning, and both the fighters and their audience could travel to and from Dubuque and neighboring towns to witness the event, using the Portage Curve station as the terminal. The fight itself took place just a short distance from the station, on one of the many islands in the Mississippi River that lie tightly packed along the eastern banks. Such islands were frequently used for events that were of questionable legality, as these were long viewed as being out of bounds and beyond the reach of adjoining state authorities, who would otherwise ban such activities. On this occasion, Billy Hines knocked out Jack Edwards in 4 rounds.
By 1903, A considerable interlocking tower with 32 levers was constructed at Portage Curve, enabling trains to traverse between the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy trackage and the Illinois Central trackage at full speed. At this time, the small station house was moved several hundred feet northwest, near the new interlocking tower, to be used for storage. Since trains would no longer be stopping at the switching point, the railroads no longer intended to use the station house for passengers or ticket sales. Just a few years later, in 1906, an automatic block system was installed at Portage Curve, removing the need for manual operators.
However, in the years to follow, trains continued to stop at Portage Curve, perhaps as a result of the volume of train traffic from the three competing railways that traverse the Illinois Central trackage from here to Dubuque. The Chicago Great Western and Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railway schedules were synchronized sufficiently that patrons on each of the railways could interchange at Portage Curve, with little layover time, although there is no evidence of a station house being present then.
In spite of the new switching and interlocking systems put in place along these 17 miles of trackway, a very bad accident did occur here, just to the north of Portage, in early 1907. A northwest-bound freight train lost a stock car as it traveled, due to a broken brake beam. The errant stock car landed directly in the path of a southeast-bound Chicago Great Western train, traveling at 30 to 40 miles per hour. The brakeman jumped just in time to save his life. The crash threw the CGW engine and several cars down an embankment. However, the engineer, James Kellogg, and fireman Albert Bond were caught in the wreckage, which immediately caught fire. Their bodies were burned beyond recognition by the time they could be retrieved from the twisted wreckage.
By the early 1930s, as the Chicago Great Western transformed primarily into a freight carrier, Portage Curve began to officially appear on CGW train schedules, but noting that it was the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad which governed the stop. And so it may be that freight cars could be moved from one carrier to another as trains awaited clearance for usage of the tracks between Portage Curve and Dubuque.
The final stop in Jo Daviess County, Illinois, is at East Dubuque, almost 13 miles to the north-northwest. Today there is no path from Portage Curve or Galena Junction via automobile or bicycle that even remotely approximates the train route. Instead, we'll fly there using Google Earth. After 13 miles, we arrive at Sinsinawa Avenue in East Dubuque. Driving along this main thoroughfare for a third of a mile, we arrive at the northern limit of Sinsinawa, close to the former train station and rail yard that once served multiple railroad carriers.
The origins of East Dubuque go back to the early to mid-1800s, before the advent of railways, when steamboats paddled serenely up and down the Mississippi River, delivering passengers and freight between St. Paul, Minnesota to the north and New Orleans to the south. After the forced removal of the Native American tribes in the early to mid-1830s, the first U.S. settlers arrived in the area. Some were farmers, but most were in search of lead ore, as rich veins of the mineral had been found in the areas to the east, west, and north many years prior. But no great mining districts were to be found here. By the late 1840s, the area consisted of a few houses and fishing shanties.
However, the community's sleepy countenance changed in 1853, when the Illinois Central announced plans to build a railroad from Cairo in the far south of Illinois to the far northwest corner of Illinois, directly across from Dubuque, Iowa, one of the principal shipping stops along the Mississippi River at that time. Land speculators quickly moved in, and by December of 1853, a plat of survey for the community of Dunleith was filed with the Jo Daviess County clerk, with the plat officially completed and recorded a few months later in 1854. The community name of Dunleith appears to have been the invention of Frederick Jessup, a prominent businessman who played a major role in the initial development of the community. Jessup claimed relations to the Duke of Argyll in Scotland and wanted to give the place a Scottish-sounding name, hence Dunleith, which means the hill fort of Leith in Gaelic.
A new steamboat ferry named the A.L. Gregory soon moored on the shores of Dunleith, ferrying passengers and freight to and from the more established city of Dubuque, directly across the Mississippi River. A U.S. post office opened in August of 1854, and a building boom followed, including multiple brick storefronts and grand hotels, such as the Dunleith House and Argyll House. A large stone freight depot, 200 feet in length and 4 stories high, was erected along the waterfront. A semicircular engine house, sufficient to house 12 engines, also made of stone, was built along the new Illinois Central right-of-way. As Dunleith was to be a terminus for the Illinois Central, a large wooden passenger depot was also constructed.
The Illinois Central completed the construction of the Galena to Dunleith leg, a distance of 17 miles of trackage, in April of 1855. That same year, the first public sale of Dunleith lots opened up for purchase, and Frederick Sherwood Jessup, who had a controlling interest in the place, made the stipulation that no spirituous liquors were to be sold therein. So how did that work out? Boats carrying freight and passengers were synchronized with the schedule of the Illinois Central trains, and Dunleith was on the rise. So much so that as quickly as the spring of 1856, Dunleith was formally incorporated as a city.
But the Illinois Central Railroad had not yet fulfilled its true ambition, and looked enviously across the waters to Dubuque, where it could tap into markets to the west of the Mississippi. We will detail the achievement of that goal shortly. But for now, suffice it to say that the Illinois Central did indeed fulfill their objective within a matter of 13 years, and by so doing, turned Dunleith from an important hub or terminus, a junction between train traffic and steamboat traffic, into a pass-through, where few passengers embarked or disembarked, as most were on their way to other locations in Iowa or Illinois.
As a result, business languished in Dunleith. Building and construction slowed down to a crawl. Hotels, built to house hundreds of travelers, were largely empty. Principal investor Frederick Jessup passed away in 1856, shortly after the city's incorporation. The Argyll House Hotel shut down shortly thereafter.
By the late 1870s, residents of Dunleith recognized that their financial future was inextricably tied to its larger sister city to the west, Dubuque, Iowa, and so public meetings were held to formally change the name of the city to East Dubuque, as they felt it would be better for business to associate themselves with their more prosperous neighbor. Besides, the original advocate of the Dunleith name, Frederick Jessup, had long since passed. And so the proposition held, and the city formally changed its name from Dunleith to East Dubuque in June of 1879.
Shortly thereafter, residents of Dubuque began pushing for the idea of a wagon bridge to accommodate horse-led wagons across the Mississippi. After several options were considered, and the project was started and stopped multiple times, the Dubuque High Bridge, or Wagon Bridge, 20 feet in width, was completed in 1887. It was built high off the water, hence the name, in order to enable taller boats to pass beneath. The ferry service that had operated non-stop since the mid-1850s, from Dunleith and East Dubuque to Dubuque, was now no longer needed, making East Dubuque's dependence upon Dubuque almost complete.
By 1891, East Dubuque included businesses such as bottling works, building supplies and lumber yards, cigar manufacturers, commercial hotels, saloons, liveries, barber shops, banks, and liquor stores. The East Dubuque Rail Yard included the Illinois Central Passenger Depot, a wooden structure about 125 feet long by 25 feet wide. with wide eaves. Just across the tracks stood the smaller Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Depot, another wooden structure about 60 feet long by 20 feet wide. A CB&Q water tank stood to the south of the CB&Q station, along with a few wooden sheds. Large warehouses line the Mississippi River to the north of the passenger depots, and just to the south of the High Bridge stood an imposing wooden grain elevator, 70 feet by 90 feet in dimension.
In the year 1893, Illinois Central, which by now had a large engine roundhouse located in Dubuque, Iowa, proposed to demolish the semicircular stone roundhouse in East Dubuque. They claimed that it had not been used since the mid-1870s. However, both East Dubuque politicians and Illinois congressional leaders pushed back, pointing out that the original charter from the mid-1850s stated that the Illinois Central shall build and maintain proper shops, roundhouses, and terminal facilities within Illinois to maintain their railroad. In the end, the Illinois Central backed away from the proposal, and by 1921 had sold off the large stone structure to a foundry business, where it remained for decades thereafter. 1913 plat maps indicate that most of the original freight warehouses along the Mississippi were gone, with the exception of the large grain elevator that stood just south of the High Bridge and the Illinois Central Railroad Bridge.
Although Chicago Great Western passenger and freight trains traveled continuously through East Dubuque since the late 1880s, East Dubuque was rarely a formal stop for the railroad. We could only find one appearance for an East Dubuque stop on the 1919 CGW train schedule. Nor could we find any evidence of there being a Chicago Great Western depot of any sort in the East Dubuque rail yard. However, it is likely that since trains had to stop at East Dubuque regardless, so as to wait for the shared resource of the Dunleith Tunnel and Illinois Central Bridge, that freight cars were routinely switched between carriers here, and passengers used the junction to pass on to other railroad carriers as their destination suited.
By the 1940s, the High Bridge that was built in the 1880s was getting long in the tooth. As the United States was then engaged in a great war overseas, that being World War II, national security was a top priority, including the need for reliable internal roads and infrastructure. And so funds were appropriated to build a new bridge between East Dubuque and Dubuque. Work started in 1942, with the new bridge completed in 1943. Over 1 mile in length and 28 feet in width, linking U.S. Highway 20 from the east to the west. The new bridge was christened as the Julian Dubuque Bridge, named in honor of Dubuque's founder. The original High Bridge was demolished with the completion of the new bridge.
Today, East Dubuque is a small yet busy city along the Mississippi River, with a population of roughly 1,500 people, firmly anchoring the Illinois side of the Mississippi River at the Julian Dubuque Bridge crossing, and serving as a jumping-off point to the west.
Now we'll go back and describe the construction of the railroad tunnel and bridge that connected the cities of Dunleith and Dubuque, more than 20 years prior to the building of the High Bridge, and which set the destinies of these two cities for the century that followed. By an act of the U.S. Congress in 1866, the Dubuque and Dunleith Bridge Company was authorized to build a new railroad bridge spanning the Mississippi River between Dubuque, Iowa, and Dunleith, Illinois. The Dubuque and Dunleith Bridge Company was open to investment at that time, and within a year, the capital stock for the company was fully subscribed, with half of the stock owned by citizens of Dubuque and Iowa, and the other by New York investors.
By early 1868, the Keystone Bridge Company, owned by Andrew Carnegie of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was awarded the contract for all of the ironwork related to the bridge construction. Andrew Carnegie himself had a hand in the negotiations and sold the board of directors on the use of wrought iron versus cast iron, in which his company specialized. The stonework and western approach work was to be carried out by Reynolds, Salpaugh and Company of Rock Island for an overall price of $570,000, or about $41 million in today's money. Work commenced on driving the bridge piers in February of 1868.
As a result of the location of the proposed eastern abutment of the new bridge, a tunnel would need to be constructed through a solid limestone bluff that stood just to the northwest of the main streets of Dunleith. The tunnel was needed as otherwise the curve of the railroad would be at almost a right angle to the bridge, which is an impossible turn for railways. Instead, a short curved tunnel would be drilled through the cliff face, providing trains with a more reasonable turn as they approached the bridge from the east, or as they departed the bridge from the west. The tunnel work was to be carried out by Krubaugh and Allen, and the tunnel work cutting commenced in March of 1868.
By May of 1868, the bridge project had 2 or 3 construction teams working throughout the night and day. For the tunnel, 2 sets of men drilled into the cliff face, one from the western face of the bluff and the other along the southern face. Together, they had completed about a quarter of the tunnel length by this time. Midsummer brought the commencement of Carnegie's ironwork, and by autumn, both the eastern and western approaches for the bridge were completed. The tunnel drilling was completed in November, averaging more than 30 feet per day since March. The new approaches and tunnel were surveyed, and tracks were soon laid down. Mid-December brought the completion of the ironwork on the bridge, the last major piece of the project.
On December 21st, a test train of passenger cars was driven through the tunnel, which proved most satisfactory to the engineers. Then, on a mild winter morning of December 29th, as a final test, a train carrying 5 passenger cars, filled with Illinois Central Railroad officials and the great and the good of Dubuque and Dunleith, passed through the tunnel and then across the bridge with great success. A celebratory dinner and party was held at the Julian House Hotel to commemorate the event and accomplishment. Just a few days later, on January 1st, 1869, the tunnel and bridge were formally opened to full train traffic. Plans were then announced to paint the bridge a light buff color with green trim.
The completed Dunleith Tunnel, although tucked away in the corner of the bluff, was a wonder for its time. Drilled through solid limestone, 840 feet in length, 18 feet in height, 20 feet wide, with a radius of curvature of approximately 650 feet. The new iron bridge was also a marvel for its day. The bridge's western approach alone was over 4,000 feet in length, with 2,400 feet consisting of a high timber trestle on a curve with a radius of 1,400 feet, curving southward to the Illinois Central Depot and rail yard. Along with the timber trestles, the western approach included 6 piers with 7 spans, almost another bridge system unto itself. This expansive trestle work was needed as the western bridge abutment was then located on an island in the Mississippi, and most of the railroad stretching westward to First Street was a marshy lagoon. The wooden trestles were shortly thereafter capped with iron trusses to better support the weight of the trains.
The original bridge proper was 1,760 feet in length, consisting of 7 spans, 4 spans of 225 feet, 2 spans of 250 feet, and a drawbridge span of 360 feet. The drawbridge was cutting-edge technology for its day. Built completely of wrought iron for strength, the draw span could swivel 90 degrees about a massive circular pier, initially driven by several men pushing a turnbuckle, enabling taller boats to pass unobstructed past the bridge. The other spans were built mostly of cast iron, although wrought iron was used for more critical components, such as the top cord of the truss. Altogether, the bridge required a whopping 1,500 tons of iron in its construction. It's a small wonder that Andrew Carnegie involved himself in the negotiations.
In the years that followed, the timber trestle work of the western approach was backfilled with earth, and most of the marshy area underlying the western approach was also filled in, forming much of the area that is today the Port of Dubuque. In 1893, the drawbridge span of the bridge was replaced by the Keystone Bridge Company, the same company that built the original in 1868. The draw span, by now, was driven by a steam engine, making it easier to open and close the draw. As the Port of Dubuque area was backfilled with earth, the first western span of the bridge was also infilled, shortening the bridge length to a little more than 1,500 feet. The bridge's original west abutment is where Star Brewery Drive passes beneath the current railroad bridge. A few more of the bridge's iron truss spans were rebuilt or repaired in 1899, and the remaining truss spans were rebuilt or repaired in the early 1900s. This time, the ironwork was supplied by the American Bridge and Iron Works of Chicago.
The tunnel and bridge were built for only a single trackway, which seemed reasonable in its day, but became a bottleneck in the decades that followed, as multiple railroads competed to pass through this somewhat narrow straw. The south portal to the Dunleith Tunnel is still clearly visible from the north end of Sinsinawa Avenue, where it sits unobtrusively behind a veil of trees and shrubs for much of the year. The entrance has changed relatively little since its original construction, except for some concrete reinforcement to the upper arch. The western portal, framed in rough limestone, although plain in appearance, still gleams in the setting sun and gazes silently across the Mississippi waters.
A short distance to the right or south of the western portal, the ramp that once formed the eastern approach to the wagon or high bridge lies embedded within the face of the bluff, ending where the bridge approach turned to the west. Viewer Bob Williams pointed out this remarkable structure to us. This high bridge remnant has remained here since the demolition of the bridge in 1943. And is a remarkable vestigial artifact of the area's history surviving from the 1800s.
Just 150 feet to the west of the western portal, the Illinois Central Railroad Bridge still takes the weight of heavy trains as they pass from terra firma crossing the river. This bridge and tunnel are still in use today, and are owned by Canadian National Railway. At one time, there would have been a continual flow of train traffic across this bridge and through the tunnel, but today, only an occasional train passes. And the drawbridge span still pirouettes about its center pier, in a ballet of boat traffic, as watercraft glisse unabated, just as they have for more than 150 years.
The next station on the Chicago Great Western route was, of course, Dubuque, Iowa, just across the Mississippi River, less than a mile from East Dubuque. The location of the former CGW Dubuque station is now completely altered from when the station once stood there 60 years ago. One of the roads that we will use to get there, US Highway 151, now runs directly through the former site. but we will get as close as we can to the location. While we drive over the Julian-Dubuque Bridge, we'll let you fly across, following the railroad bridge towards the old station. We'll see you there.
The Chicago Great Western Passenger Depot stood beneath what is today U.S. Highway 151, between 7th Street and 9th Street, about 250 feet south of 9th Street and 350 feet east of Washington Street. The much larger freight depot stood just behind it, to the northwest, between the highway and the 9th Street entrance ramp.
Dubuque was always a primary station on the Chicago Great Western Line. From the earliest days, when it was the Chicago-St. Paul and Kansas City Railroad, the first leg was built from St. Paul to Dubuque, with Dubuque as a terminus, while Stickney awaited the completion of the Chicago to Dubuque leg in 1887 and 1888. As we have discussed in previous videos, Dubuque was generally used as the division point between its hub in Olwine, Iowa, and Chicago, from its inception in 1886 to the point at which East Stockton took over this role in the 1910 timeframe. The division point is where train crews were swapped out, where train engines were watered and supplied with coal, and where repairs were made.
The first visual appearance we have of the Chicago Great Western Depot is from an 1889 bird's-eye view of the city, showing the passenger and freight depots fairly close to the location that they held for the next 80 years. Nestled within factories and vast lumber yards. As trains crossed over the bridge into the city, they first passed the old Shot Tower, a city landmark built in the mid-1850s, just to the north of the trackway. We'll talk more about the Shot Tower in a separate video, but remarkably, it has survived to this day. Chicago Great Western trains then passed over another set of trestles with iron trusses, before being switched to the north onto CGW trackage. Hundreds of feet further, they pulled into the Chicago Great Western Depot. The passenger depot is shown as a substantial two-story building with wide eaves protecting the first floor, where the platform once stood. The large freight depot stands just to the west of it.
The 1891 Sanborn maps shows both depots in much greater detail. The two-story passenger depot was built of brick, 80 feet by 25 feet in dimension, with wide eaves to the east and west overhanging the first floor, with a long platform to the east of the building, alongside a single trackway. Two large waiting rooms on the first floor consumed most of the space, the larger one for gentlemen and the smaller for ladies. The large brick freight depot to the west was 250 feet long by 50 feet wide, with a two-story office on the south end of the building. Just to the northeast of the depot stood Glabb's Railroad Dining House, which must have been somewhat gritty fare. 2 miles to the north, at the fairgrounds, outside the congestion of Dubuque's port, the Chicago Great Western Roundhouse and shops were located, which we'll discuss in greater detail in our next video in this series.
Curiously, the 1909 Sanborn map shows what appears to be the identical Chicago Great Western passenger depot, but now shifted 70 feet to 80 feet south, close to 8th Street. Either the earlier maps were incorrect, the building was physically moved, or the original building was torn down and a new one with an identical footprint and very similar plan was built. In any event, all subsequent maps and aerial photographs show it being close to 8th Street, just like the 1909 Sanborn map. In later decades, the western awning along the first floor was removed, and in the last few decades of its existence, both awnings were removed. Aerial photographs also show that the Dubuque passenger station house was torn down sometime between 1960 and 1970, likely 1 or 2 years prior to 1970.
Another key component for governing the complex Dubuque railway system was Dubuque Junction, an interlocking plant installed by Illinois Central in 1909, so as to control traffic from the Illinois Central, the Chicago Great Western, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads. Every train passed within a few feet of it on its way westward or eastward. This interlock building was located just where the three trackways diverge or converge, about 1,700 feet west of the Illinois Central Bridge, today a little more than 300 feet south of 7th Street. Like most of the railway infrastructure in this area, the building has since been torn down and has been replaced by a copse of trees.
The city of Dubuque has one of the richest and oldest histories in the U.S. Upper Midwest. In its younger days, in the mid-1800s, it was one of the grand ladies of the Mississippi, or at least a lady-in-waiting. Those cities included New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Dubuque, and St. Paul. These were the great port cities of the mighty Mississippi, arguably America's first superhighway, along which passengers and goods traveled north and south, from the Gulf of Mexico to the timberlands of Minnesota.
The origins of the city are fairly well understood, and all center around French-Canadian trapper, explorer, and businessman Julien Dubuque, who entered the area in the mid-1780s in search of lead ore, encountering the Meskwaki people of the Fox tribe, living near Catfish Creek, where it empties into the Mississippi River. Over time, he earned their trust, and they eventually revealed to him the location of a rich lead mine and granted him permission to mine it, which ultimately made his fortune.
We'll discuss Julien Dubuque and his life in more detail in a separate video, but for now it's sufficient to say that Julien Dubuque died in 1810. And in spite of multiple parties hoping to cash in on Dubuque's valuable mines after his death, they were rebuffed, first by the Meskwaki people themselves, and next by the U.S. government, which in a rare turn of events supported the Meskwaki claims to ownership. This kept intruders and settlement at bay, more or less, for another 2 decades. However, after Black Hawk's unsuccessful attempt to retake his homeland in Illinois, this provided the U.S. government the excuse to push the Fox and Sauk further into Iowa and beyond, opening up much of the eastern portion of the territory of Iowa for colonization, when scores of miners and mining companies moved in during the early 1830s to exploit Dubuque's dormant mines.
This new mining settlement was on the very edge of civilization at that time, a rough and ready place, populated mostly by men, where drinking and gambling were the primary forms of recreation. It was said that vice and immorality were prevalent in virtually every form. Fights and bloodshed were commonplace, due to drunken quarrels and disputes over land claims. It was the original Wild West, long before the legendary Wild West of the late 19th century. One example narrative describes how a large, powerful man by the name of William Goodfellow got into a dispute with another man, nicknamed Jim Crow, within a Dubuque saloon. During the melee, Goodfellow is said to have buried an axe into Crow's back, severing a few ribs from the spine, whereupon Crow, a renowned fighter, turned and gave Goodfellow a punishing beating, in spite of his severe wounds. Although this story may be apocryphal, Contemporary records do indicate that these were in fact real people, living in a dangerous place and time.
Nonetheless, Dubuque did outgrow these early wild days, and early residents began to attend to civic responsibilities. At a public meeting in 1833, residents formally named the settlement in honor of Julian Dubuque, recognizing him as the first settler of the area. They built a schoolhouse and church assembly hall, then the first Catholic church by 1835. By the year 1840, Dubuque's population had reached 1,000 people. Iowa was admitted into the Union of the United States a few years later in 1846, with Dubuque's population now at 2,500, the largest city in Iowa at that time. A year later, in 1847, Dubuque formally incorporated as a city, and within 3 more years, the population had grown to 3,000.
By the mid-1860s, Dubuque was described as being advantageously situated on the west bank of the Mississippi River, standing on a plateau of ground elevated well above high water, with surrounding bluffs rising to a height of 175 feet. A small marshy island fronted the city, which was actively being used for business purposes. The population was now at 16,000 people, with nearly 1/3 of the inhabitants speaking German. The city now included a U.S. Customs House, a U.S. Post Office, a U.S. District Court building, the county courthouse and building, a city hall, a general market, a large hall capable of seating 5,000 people, 18 churches, several schools, multiple banks, 5 hotels, numerous stores and warehouses, 6 breweries, 2 large distilleries, foundries, flouring mills, factories, and quarries. Due to the rapid growth of the city, streets now stretched up and over the bluffs, with many elegant residences built along them. It was the hub and terminus of multiple railroads, and was also the headquarters for steamboats on the northern Mississippi. Several lumber yards and steam sawmills lined the port area, continually supplied by rafts of logs sent down from Wisconsin and Minnesota to the north.
The latter portion of the 1800s brought relative prosperity. A board of trade was organized, while business and manufacturing grew, with sewing machines, doors and sashes, brewery products, bricks, and steam engines being shipped down the Mississippi to faraway places. The first electric power companies were formed, followed quickly by electric street railways. Real estate values soared with the prosperous times. Cultural improvements also came. The Dubuque Opera Company was organized, and a fine arts gallery opened. Literary societies and libraries flourished, and the Carnegie Stout Public Library was built in 1902. The emerging sport of baseball rapidly developed a following in Dubuque, being one of the first cities to support a professional baseball team, playing at ball fields to the north of the city. Horse racing also became a popular recreation, with races held at Nutwood Park, at the fairgrounds north of Dubuque. By 1900, Dubuque's flourishing population had reached more than 36,000.
Thereafter, however, while other Mississippi port cities continued to see strong growth, including Davenport, Iowa to the south, Dubuque's population leveled off for a period of decades, only growing to 44,000 by 1940, an increase of only 22%. Dubuque's population surged again starting in the 1940 timeframe, but has since leveled off between 55,000 and 60,000 residents since 1960. Today, Dubuque is a thriving city with an economy based in manufacturing, bolstered by healthcare, education, tourism, publishing, and financial services. In recent years, it has invested heavily in improvements to parks, trails, and greenways, especially along its scenic Mississippi riverfront, once crowded with lumber yards, warehouses, and heavy industry. Like most cities, Dubuque struggles with embracing the future while preserving the past. Old railroad depots and rail yards have long ago been swept away, but Dubuque has nonetheless managed to hold on to much of the city's early fabric and treasures. It is indeed a multifaceted gem within a limestone setting. And perhaps Julian Dubuque gazes down from his bluff-top burial mound to his former home below, in wonder at the remarkable place that it has become.
If you are enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. It helps our channel grow and enables us to make more videos like this. In our next video, we'll continue onwards through Dubuque to the Fairground Station, then hop on the Iowa Heritage Trail to investigate disused stations heading west towards Dyersville, Iowa. But that's a story for another day. We'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.